Okay, so part 5 of the flipped classroom, I realize this is getting a little long. Remember, we're looking at 3 chapters worth of information. So this is a really brief overview of what's in your textbook. Now we're going to focus on one of the most interesting parts of the medieval times or the Middle Ages, and that is the relationship of the church and how the church became entrenched in European society. So before this time period, in the 400s, Christianity was not throughout all of Europe. I mean, it had been one of many religions in the Roman Empire. And throughout this time, especially towards the end, is when Christianity becomes the force. It becomes the force early on in Western Europe. And then as time goes on, it becomes a force that connects Western Europe to Eastern Europe, and then Eastern Europe into Nordic Europe. So people become Christians. So not only was this something that unified people in a time when things were pretty decentralized, but it was also a connection to the ancient world because this was the religion that Rome, later Roman emperors, converted to and then became the official religion of the empire. Like I showed you early on, kings and lords were the protectors of the papacy. Oops, it's not are of the papacy. They are protectors. Let's just write that in there. They're protectors of the church, and the church is the protector of, and the church provides authority for the kings and lords. Now, this is not a new relationship, but it is extremely important. And also, during medieval Europe, because of this decentralization, as you can see in this illumination, the king here is kneeling and the Pope is giving him his crown. So, who has more authority here? The church. So, the power between the church and state oscillates during this time period. And by the end of the time period, the state has more power than the church. During this time period, there was also the Great Schism of 1054, which led to the formation of Eastern Orthodox Christianity. And then Catholicism became more firmly entrenched. This also had a big impact in the Crusades, which we'll talk about in just a moment. Monasteries were a huge piece of life during this time period in the Middle Ages. The Saint Benedict and Saint Scholastica created the orders of monks. But monasteries provided basically every service to the people. Because the state was so weak, they were in charge of every service that you could possibly think of. They were the orphanages. They were the rudimentary hospitals, although they didn't do a lot of curing of the sick. They provided schools going way back to the Carolingian Empire, this idea of the monastery being the school. They had scriptoriums where they were copying texts, thus being scholastic centers. This is where, if there were books, they were in the monastery. They were in the monastery. And remember, there is no printing press at this time. So books are few and far between. And a scriptorium, and I'll just write that here for you, is where monks would copy text by hand. By hand. That's how books were copied, and they were all copied onto parchment, which is a kind of animal skin. So they were few and far between. They were also centers of agriculture and adult beverage making, and they had these huge, magnificent gardens. Christianity was also a big cultural force. Most literature, art, and music, like the building of cathedrals and the creating of songs and stories and the copying of Bibles, that was because of Christianity. They also provided cathedral schools, which eventually turned into early universities. These schools included, and I just want to give you some examples of universities that were founded during this time period. I'm going to switch colors so you can see it easily. So Bologna in Italy was founded in 1088. The Oxford in England, 1096. There was a Spanish university, Salamanca, that was founded in 1134. And in 1160, the University of Paris was founded. And these were based off of, again, those cathedral schools. St. Thomas Aquinas, he brought philosophy from Greece and reconciled it with Christian thought. So basically the doctrines of Christianity today and the philosophies of Christianity today have him to thank. And they were also responsible for all this, the new knowledge coming in, because again, of these universities, right? Okay, now what if you were just a regular person? Remember, 90+% of people couldn't read at this time. Christianity was more of a, like, the way you spent your entire life. So the first reason for that was because of sacraments. Sacraments were hugely important. The church brought you into this world and it took you out of that. And between there was communion and marriage and a lot of other sacraments that you needed to do. And these sacraments were paid for, right? There was devotion to different saints. So there was, I wouldn't say cultish devotion around saints, but there was this idea that different saints were there to provide different, you would pray to different saints if you needed different things. And besides this, the church offered indulgences. And we're going to see these play a role later on at the end and towards the Renaissance. Indulgences were money that you could give to pay to the church to get your loved ones out of purgatory. It could be a post-mortem thing, so after somebody died, or it could be something that you did while you were living. Sorry, I spelled that wrong. And these indulgences eventually become a big problem for the church, but at this time, people bought them. The other thing is that the church had these relics, and people would go on pilgrimages to see these relics. This is from Notre Dame. This is called a reliquary. It's what the relics are stored in. And these were pieces of the Christian story, and they were believed to have certain powers, like to heal you if you were sick, to get rid of leprosy, to, if you were at a point in life where you didn't know what was going on, like what you were going to do next, you could go on a pilgrimage and try to figure it out. This particular reliquary held a piece of the cross, a nail from when Jesus was nailed to the cross, and a crown of thorns. Other common relics were veils that Mary had worn, etc., etc. Now, there were like 10 different veils that Mary had worn, just at one time circulating. And these pilgrimages were like a huge deal. It's one of the reasons that huge churches like Notre Dame de Paris, which I hope you recognize, especially from this front facade here, were built. And these churches took years and years and years and years to build. And also, in addition to that, they were like living storybooks. And we'll talk more about that in class. Okay. So getting to women's role in the Middle Ages and the role of the church in the Middle Ages, the church provided a third path for women. Originally, women, could become a wife. They could probably become a single old person, and then they'd be a social outcast. And now, if they didn't want to get married, they could become a nun, devote themselves to the Lord. A lot of women did this, whether it was faith-based or to get out of marriage, that only they know. Women also moved to cities where they had more freedom. They could run shops, they could perform different tasks, and especially early on, they were accepted by guilds. As the Middle Ages became more stable, this was not as common of a practice, but especially early on, they were accepted by guilds. And in the country, they often ran manors while their husbands were away. I have two pictures here for you, and then we'll pause and move on to the next video. The first is of different tasks of upper class women. So you have a woman reading this story to these men, you have a woman getting married, painting her portrait, and last but not least, teaching someone geometry. And then these women are hunting.